leading into Pesach. We've got Professor Usher Susher here, and we are looking forward to hearing from him. I'm going to turn it over now to David DeWitt to make the introductions.
Thank you, Les. Welcome, everyone. And I know that Mark and John and I are thrilled to be able to share a screen with our friend, longtime friend and colleague, Usher Susser, who's really become a principal pillar of what we've done over these years in Israel Dialogues. Having Usher be with us on a regular basis gives us insights that we otherwise unlikely would receive. For those of you who haven't had the pleasure, the opportunity of hearing from Usher before, I think you should know that he is currently a professor emeritus of Middle Eastern history at Tel Aviv University. He was the director for quite a number of years of Tel Aviv University's Moshe Dayan Center for Middle Eastern Studies. I think, Usher, it's still Middle Eastern and African Studies?
Yes. Yeah,
Middle East and African Studies. And a renowned scholar both in Israel and abroad of contemporary Middle East history. When Usher and I were speaking earlier, I had suggested that he focus his remarks today on issues emerging and covered by his most recent book, Jordan, Palestine, and the Politics of Collective Identity. But as things have evolved and continue to evolve, he came back to us with the suggestion of the following title: Trump, the Arabs, and the New Middle Eastern Balance of Power. That's the kind of title I would expect more from an international relations scholar than a scholar of Middle Eastern history. And yet, as Trump and as Netanyahu and as Arab leaders and European leaders, and of course the activists in Hamas have all at various times been taking the center stage. We really are in a world in which a focus on Trump, the Arabs, and the new Middle Eastern balance of power is the kind of thing we really need to focus on. So, Usher, thank you very much. The screen is yours.
Well, thank you very much, David, for your very kind introduction, as always. It's a pleasure to be with you and to be associated with Holy Blossom, as I have been for so many years. Indeed, I will be talking about Trump, the Arabs, and the changing regional balance of power. But I will set this in a historical context that I hope will be illuminating what I call the framing of the regional strategic landscape. A snapshot of half a century of historical change in the Middle East region, headed, I would say, by what I have called in the past the crisis of the Arabs, the weakness of the Arab collective, what some Arabs call the fragmentation of Arab decision-making. UN Arab Human Development reports over the last decades have pointed to three deficits that the Arab countries suffer from: the deficit of democracy, the deficit of first world education systems, and the deficit of gender equality. And I think the first two, the deficit in democracy and the deficit in first world education systems, have most Arab countries with economies that fail to compete with the international globalized economy of recent years. And perhaps most damaging of all is the lack of gender equality. The lack of gender equality is spoken of a lot as politically correct to talk about, but it has a lot to do with Arab economies. The low participation of women in the workforce, the fact that women are somewhat less educated than men, leads to poorly performing economies with rapidly growing populations because of high birth rates. The result is catastrophic. This is not a prediction about what will happen, but what is already happening in most of the Arab countries, those who do not have the benefit of being hugely wealthy with natural resources. Therefore, the Arab world has a growing population which they cannot sustain. In 2000, there were 280 million Arabs. Now the number has nearly doubled, and we're talking about close to 500 million Arabs. And therefore, the huge pressure that the Western developed world feels of Arab willingness to emigrate. When Trump talks about 2 million Gazans leaving the Gaza Strip, and people saying, well, many people in Gaza want to leave, they don't want to leave for Jordan and Egypt. They want to emigrate to Canada and to Western Europe. It's not about being relocated in some other poor Arab country. And in this area of great economic difficulty, we can also mention and focus on what I call the resilience of tradition. Societies are far more traditional than sociologists expected in the 1950s, for example. Daniel Lerner wrote a very famous book in the late 1950s called The Passing of Traditional Society. Well, in the Middle East, it didn't pass. It's still very much there, carrying with it this long tradition of association between religion and state. And I think you will notice much about, when I talk about the Arab countries, much of this also applies to Israel, where Israel is far more traditional than the founding fathers of the secularizing Zionist experience would have thought. And here I mention another book, which is worth reading, Michael Walzer's The Paradox of Liberation, which he published in 2015, talking about how secular revolutions have not succeeded in producing younger generations that will follow and keep up the secularizing process. And it covers 3 countries, India, Israel, and Algeria. And what I would have done if I would have written that book, I would have written about India, Israel, and instead of Algeria, Turkey. But the message is clear. And in the Arab countries, this resilience of tradition weds religion and state, has people for centuries identifying themselves as members of groups rather than societies of individuals, families, extended families, tribes, and religious sects are what identified people rather than individuals. Arab nationalism was the great secularizing platform that was supposed to change all this. The idea of Arab nationalism is essentially based on a European idea, that nations are defined by the language they speak. Germans are German who speak the language of German. Arabs are Arabs who speak the language of Arabic. Not about their religion, but about their culture. Their language is their identity. Therefore, Christians and Muslims and Druze are all associated together by the language they speak. But Arab nationalism was a political failure. And the secularizing platform never really did the job that Arab nationalists hoped it would do. And we have what Bernard Lewis years ago called the return of Islam, which wasn't really the return of Islam. It had never really departed. And you have, in the Middle East of the present, the fragmentation and destabilization of key Arab states because of these sectarian divides, which are extremely relevant politically. And this destabilization, crisis of the Arabs, the weakness of the Arab states, has led in the last half century to a new Middle East, in which the non-Arab states are the preeminent powers: Iran, Turkey, and Israel. And that's the story of the changing balance of power that we speak about now. It's much more about the changing balance of power in the Middle East of today between Iran, Turkey, and Israel than it is between the Arab states. As players, they're very much in the back seat. And states in the Middle East compete with each other as Sunnis versus Shiites, Sunni Muslims versus Shiite Muslims, rather than republicans versus monarchies, or pro-Soviet versus pro-American of an era long past. So the discussion of the new regional balance of power is mainly of the non-Arab states: Shiite Iran, Sunni Turkey, and Jewish Israel. When the Assad regime fell in Syria in December 2024, the question that people asked, where are the Iranian and Russian allies of the Assad regime? The Arabs were hardly even mentioned. Assad fell because the Iranians and Russians didn't support him well enough. It wasn't even discussed as an Arab issue. So when we talk about the war between Israel and Hamas, the big deal is the Iranian strategic retreat. This is the big story. Hezbollah's defeat in Lebanon by Israel, the overthrow of Assad in Syria, the crushing of Hamas, have all paved the way to the rolling back of the so-called Shiite Crescent, that which came into being after the folly of the US invasion of Iraq in 2003. The overthrow of Saddam Hussein maybe was a good idea in the sense that Saddam was an evil man heading an evil regime. But overthrowing Saddam and overthrowing the Ba'ath in Iraq opened the Arab East to Iranian intrusion. Saddam was the gatekeeper of the Arab East. And the removal of Saddam was the opening of the gates of the Arab East all the way to the Mediterranean for Iranian intrusion, the likes of which had never been in the modern era. This has now been reversed, a dramatic change in the aftermath of the war in Gaza. And Turkey and Israel gain at Iran's expense. Trump can talk about a nuclear deal with Iran on the basis of the assumption, correctly, that Iran is now much weaker and possibly more amenable to an agreement on the nuclear issue. Iran, as shown by Israel's attack on Iranian defenses in October 24, Iran is extremely vulnerable, more than ever, to Israeli and obviously US air attack. And the question can be asked in reference to Iran, what is the objective of any kind of negotiation with Iran? Is it about an attack on the nuclear facilities if an agreement doesn't work? Is the objective the nuclear facilities? Or is the objective a much grander one? A grand bargain between Iran, the United States, Israel, and other powers on Iran's place in the region, which I would argue is a much more strategic design than just the elimination of its nuclear facilities, which could be just a temporary job that will be recovered after a few years. And as the balance of power changes, the increasing tension between Israel and Turkey playing itself out in Syria, which is that territory located between Turkey and Israel. Turkey's extended regional reach, especially into the Syrian interior. The expansion of Turkey's regional influence at Iran's expense in Syria and in Iraq. The undoing of the Iranian circle of fire that the Iranians established on Israel's borders have allowed Israel to expand into southern Syria. Israel now looks at the post-October 7 Middle Eastern arena. Israel has yet to overcome the unbelievable shock of October 7. Israel now bent on preventing the location, the deployment of potentially hostile forces adjacent to Israel's boundaries. And therefore Israel pushing back in Lebanon, Israel pushing back in Syria, Israel's expansion into southern Syria to create buffer zones that will prevent the deployment on Israel's borders of potentially hostile forces, where a repeat of the disaster of October 7 could happen again. Israel is taking constant military action against Syrian military assets, destroying the remnants of the Syrian army, including airfields, to prevent their use by Turkey. That if these airfields become part of Turkey's regional clout, they could interfere with Israel's freedom of action in the airspace above Syria. This is all part of an Israeli strategy to prevent the concentration of hostile or potentially hostile forces on its borders, creating now a heightened tension and potential friction between Israel and Turkey in Syria. A completely new ballgame. Not Iran, Turkey. Turkey is assisting in the buildup of a large Syrian army. The objective that the Turks have is to stabilize a unified, stable Syrian state, whereas Israel is deeply concerned about the emergence of a very powerful, centralized and militarized Syrian state. And Israel seeks to maintain connections, which the Turks do not approve of, with minorities in Syria, like the Druze or the Kurds, that could interfere with the territorial integrity and stability of a new Syria, which is the Turkish design. And the question that Israel must ask itself now versus Turkey is the question it should have asked itself versus Iran years before. What is the Turkish objective? Is this about self-defense or aggressive design? When Israel referred to Turkey, to Iran in the past, far more emphasis was put on potential Iranian aggressive design than on the possibility that what the Iranians were really after was some kind of self-defense against intrusion in their own internal affairs and the overthrow of their own regime. And I don't think Israel gave enough room for the possibility that what Iran was after was more about its own self-defense than about aggressive designs. And the same may be true about Turkey in the present case. Turkey, one must remember, as opposed to Iran, is a member of NATO. And that makes the association with the US and Israel a totally different ballgame to that which existed with Iran. The Turks say they are securing their southern border and stabilizing Syria. They seek stability, not confrontation. They want to prevent Kurdish autonomy so as not to have Kurdish autonomy in Syria interrupting and interfering with the Kurdish affair in Turkish domestic politics. The Turks also want to see the return of millions of Syrian refugees who are presently in Turkey, a great burden on the Turkish state and economy. And favorably, one must say, in the last few days, there have been reports on deconfliction talks between Turkey and Israel, and hopefully that is the direction that things will take. And Israel looks at its new old neighborhood, state by state, as things change in each one of them. Syria is all about the sectarian conundrum in this Syrian state established from the outset in the 1920s as a mosaic of minorities. The difficulty in stabilizing the new regime in Syria because of the fears of the minorities, the Kurds, the Alawis, the Druze, and the Christians, being hounded by what might prove to be an Islamic jihadist regime. Violent clashes have very recently taken place, where hundreds, if not thousands of Alawis, the great supporters of the previous regime, the Assad regime, who were massacred along the coastal area of Syria where the Alawis are located in their more or less autonomous region. So the new regime in Syria is not a stable political entity, but one in which the minorities are still struggling with the central regime over the balance of power in the newly forming Syrian state. The balance of power in Lebanon is changing too between the different minorities that have made up Lebanon since the 1920s. The defeat of Hezbollah has greatly weakened Hezbollah and the Shiite community, the largest minority in Lebanon. Hezbollah has been greatly weakened, but has not given up its fight for hegemony in the Lebanese state. There is an ongoing and yet undecided political struggle to disarm Hezbollah in Lebanon. And the weakening of Hezbollah has allowed for the reassertion of the central government headed by the Maronite Christian president and the Sunni Muslim prime minister, leading to a situation where the central government now has the authority, at least the attempt to impose its authority, to engage in a negotiation with Israel on the finalization of the border between Israel and Lebanon, where there are numerous zones of friction and disagreement between the two countries, a negotiation that could not have taken place if Hezbollah was still as powerful as it once was in Lebanon. And the fact that there is this negotiation between Israel and Lebanon is an indication of the downgrading of Hezbollah as the central government is now exercising its own authority more effectively than before. Lebanese commentators, one must admit mostly Christians, are openly talking about normalization with Israel. That was not par for the course only months ago. Clearly, Hezbollah's war with Lebanon is most unpopular in Lebanon today. The war with Israel, in the service of Iran, as many Lebanese would see it, is not as popular as it once was. And there is more talk about Hezbollah disarming, possibly in exchange for Israel's complete withdrawal from southern Lebanon. The weakening of Iran is also apparent with the Shiite Muslim community in Iraq. The fear that the US may attack pro-Iranian militias in Iraq, up to the point where the Shiites of Iraq are now talking about the possible partitioning of Iraq into separate states, a separate Shiite Iraq. That would be a safe haven for Iran as Iran's regional clout declines. And now we come to Jordan and Egypt, the focus of Trump's ideas. Jordan and Egypt, as opposed to the other countries we've spoken about, are relatively homogeneous states. Jordan and Egypt are not mosaics of minorities. Both Jordan and Egypt are similar in the sense that they have very large, stable, Sunni, Muslim, Arab majorities. 90% of the Egyptians are Sunni Muslims. 90% or more of the Jordanians are Sunni Muslims too. True, the Jordanians are divided between Jordanians and Palestinians, but Jordanianism and Palestinianism are not religious ideas, not religious sects, but relatively new national identities which pale in comparison to the sectarian divide. So both Jordan and Egypt are relatively stable, as opposed to Lebanon, Syria, and Iraq. And for Jordan and Egypt, the war in Gaza was the cause of great fear for destabilization of both these countries. The war in Gaza, as you will recall in its early months, had a mass movement of population in Gaza to and fro, which gave rise to great fear in Egypt that the Gazan Palestinians would be pushed into Egypt. And in Jordan, there were fears not about the Palestinians in Gaza, but the Palestinians in the West Bank. Whereas the war in Gaza progressed, Palestinians in the West Bank suffered from settler violence against Palestinians that the Jordanians feared was designed to push the Palestinians into Jordan to create what the Jordanians call the alternative homeland conspiracy. The Jordanians are terrified with the idea, voiced by people on the Israeli right, that Israel's long-term design is to push the Palestinians out of the West Bank into Jordan, to create the Palestinian state in Jordan, rather than in the West Bank and Gaza. So the Israeli-Jordanian relationship operates on two contradictory levels or tracks. On the one hand, Israel and Jordan are regional strategic allies. Jordan and Israel have common interests against Iran. Jordan and Israel have common interests in Syria, the stabilization of Syria, preventing the creation of a jihadi regime in Syria. The Jordanian common cause with Israel versus Iran was also one that allowed for Jordanian participation in the defense of Israel, as you will remember, on two occasions of Iranian missile attacks on Israel in 2024. So Israel and Jordan have a lot of strategic common ground. But Israel is also a strategic threat to Jordan at one and the same time. The Jordanians believe that the two-state solution is the securest approach for the kingdom. Jordan is Jordan, and Palestine is Palestine. Jordan is not Palestine. And the state of Palestine must be created in Palestine as part of the two-state solution, and not instead of Jordan as part of some other solution. But Israel presently is more unwilling than ever before to seriously consider the two-state idea after the 7th of October. And Netanyahu's refusal to engage in planning for the day after the war in Gaza is designed to prevent the two-state idea. Saudi normalization is yet to make serious progress because of the Saudi demand for some progress on the Palestinian cause. And for the Saudis, the Palestinian cause is not just rhetoric for the sake of public opinion. The Saudis firmly believe, more so after the 7th of October, that the creation of some form of two-state solution, a Palestinian state, is part and parcel of the future regional stable order. The future regional stability requires the creation of a Palestinian state, the Saudis would argue, not just about rhetoric for public consumption, but rather regional security. But here the Israelis and the Saudis also differ, and not only on the question of including the Palestinian state idea. For the Saudis, normalization with Israel is the path to a defense treaty with the United States, not the path to war with Iran. Whereas for Israel, it has much to do with aligning other Arab states alongside Israel against Iran. Israel made numerous impressive gains in the war. The crushing of Hamas, not just the dismantling of the military units of Hamas and causing them huge casualties. The manpower of Hamas is replaceable. More effective was the dismantling of Hamas's weapon manufacturing capacity. That is much more difficult to replace. manpower they have at no great cost. But the recreation of their weapon manufacturing capacity is a very important achievement that Israel maintained, and reducing Hamas's military threat to Israel considerably. There is a lot of internal Palestinian and Arab criticism of Hamas, accusing Hamas of bringing a new catastrophe on the Palestinians by rogue and irresponsible behavior, launching a war that Hamas could not win, engaging in reprehensible, immoral behavior which is disgraceful for the Palestinians, the fall of Assad in Syria, the overall Iranian geostrategic setback. All of these have been gains for Israel. Hanging in there in this list of Iranian assets that have been lost are the Houthis. Still there, still hanging in, but facing a much tougher US approach, degrading Houthi capabilities. Just a word on the Houthis, who they are and why they're interested in Israel at all. The Houthis are Shiite Muslims like the Iranians, but they belong to a different branch of Shiite Islam. The Iranians and the Houthis share their association with Shia, but they are different branches of Shiite Islam. But they are not full allies, but partial allies. Not everything the Houthis do is at the beck and call of the Iranians. But certainly they are supported and supplied by the Iranians. The Houthis, Shiites in northern Yemen, are in political competition with the Sunni Muslims in southern Yemen, and therefore the interest in Palestine. The Houthis are interested in the war in Palestine as a vehicle for their promotion in the Yemeni internal sectarian struggle. So it's not just the Houthis attacking Israel for no apparent cause. It makes a lot of sense in terms of Yemeni domestic politics. So Israel has made great achievements and had great achievements in the war. But Israel also suffers from attrition at many levels. First of all, just looking at the size of these powers, Israel, Iran, and Turkey. Israel has a population of 10 million people and a territory of 22,000 square kilometers. Iran and Turkey have 90 million people each, 9 times the population of Israel. Turkey is 900,000 square kilometers. It is 40 times Israel. And Iran has 1.6 million square kilometers, 72 times Israel. So when we put Iran, Turkey, and Israel in the same basket of the non-Arab powers who have the controlling influence in the Middle East, Israel is not exactly in the same league as Turkey and Iran, and that should be remembered. Israel has, since its foundation, had a military doctrine where, because of the size of its population and territory, Israel sought to fight short wars that would be fought by a predominantly reservist army. Israel cannot, with its small population, maintain a huge standing army. But the war in Gaza was not a short war, but the longest in Israel's history. Very much against the very fundamentals of Israel's military doctrine from the early years. The human and financial cost have been enormous. The reserve army, after a year and a half, is exhausted. They have never had to fight such a long war. The Yom Kippur War was over in 3 weeks. And the Six-Day War, as its name suggests, in a lot less. We are now 18 months into this business, and it is far from over. Nearly 1,000 soldiers have been killed and about 15,000 wounded, injured seriously, a huge burden on Israeli society. There is a lack of consensus, the likes of which has never existed in Israeli society, on the war itself. Certainly on the last phase, the most recent phase, the renewal of the war in Gaza. There is profound disagreement in Israeli society over priorities. What is the war being fought for? The distrust of Netanyahu, the sense, the belief, the feeling of many that the war is serving Netanyahu's political needs, the preservation of his coalition, the most right-wing coalition in Israel's history, rather than seeking first and foremost, above all else, the repatriation of the hostages. The argument that the Israeli cabinet is staffed by incompetent and inexperienced ministers under Netanyahu. And there is a manpower crisis that ought to be resolved, many think, by the mobilization of the ultra-Orthodox, which is proving to be an impossible objective for this government, which is seeking every way of avoiding the mobilization of the ultra-Orthodox for the sake of the maintenance of Netanyahu's coalition. In the meantime, Israel is suffering from serious emigration, a brain drain. Since 7th of October, some 90,000 Israelis have emigrated. Over 8,000 high-tech people are amongst the immigrants. Professionals, doctors, academics, talking about leaving. The declining performance of the Israeli education system. There is more governmental financial support for the ultra-Orthodox yeshivot than there is for Israeli higher education. There is an erosion of the quality and the quantity of Israel's human capital. And this is not unnoticed by Arab commentators. Israel, they say, as one of them has done, caught in the eye of a social and political storm that has been brewing for years. The reverse migration that he refers to will reinforce the right, he says, as the brain drain continues from economic and academic centers of power. Israelis talk about Palestinians emigrating from Gaza when 90,000 have left Israel. So the Arab commentator says, Israel should be worried about the Israelis who are leaving Israel and not the Palestinians who are supposed to leave Gaza. Without the US, Israel is nothing more than a dry leaf blowing in the wind, says one commentator in one of the Arab newspapers. And it is against that background that Trump's plan for Gaza sits on the Middle Eastern pot of instability and local concern. Trump's plan for Gaza, if you look at the region as we have described it, to speak of Trump as the proverbial bull in the china shop seems to be far belittling to the real challenge that he brings to the region. As one Israeli wrote, Trump appears like a hurricane threatening to destroy everything in its path, only to vanish in a cloud of dust. Another says, Trump's policies are a collection of question and exclamation marks in random disorder. So looking at the Trump ideas, if ideas they are, as seen from Jordan and Egypt, from the Arab point of view, Trump's ideas are supportive of the Israeli idea of expelling the Palestinians from Gaza. One can say from now until eternity that this is about the free choice of emigration. The Arabs will see this as expulsion. The word in Arabic is tajir, that is to expel. And that is how the Arabs refer to it. For Egypt, this is an undermining of their national security interests, having hundreds of thousands of Palestinians, many supporters of the Muslim Brethren, Hamas, being pushed into Sinai in a manner that the Egyptians would see as greatly threatening to the domestic security of the Egyptian state. For the Jordanians, the idea that 1 million or so Palestinians emigrate from Gaza into Jordan is the nightmare scenario in itself. And most dangerously of all, for the Jordanians and the Egyptians, this threat of pushing hundreds of thousands of Palestinians into their territories is a threat to the peace treaties. It is not a stabilizing force, but destabilizing the two most stable components of the Arab state disorder at present. Trump's economic threat to the Jordanians and the Egyptians, that is, their aid to these countries will be denied, based on the notion that money can buy it all, is rejected by both the Jordanians and the Egyptians. And one should look at the Jordanian experience. The Americans tried to force the Jordanians into Camp David by economic threats. They tried to do the same to coerce the Jordanians to support the war against Saddam Hussein in 1990-91. The Jordanians refused, then and now. There are alternative Arab sources if need be, and the Jordanians will not commit political suicide, even for American aid. So the Egyptians have put forward the alternative Arab plan, which is essentially the Egyptian plan, based on the following points. And with this, I will conclude. Keeping the two-state option open, keeping the people in Gaza and not pushing them out, opening the opportunity for Palestinian Authority governance in Gaza, that is, replacing Hamas with the Palestinian Authority. The problem with this Egyptian plan, it's very vague on Hamas. How exactly is Hamas going to be overpowered by the Palestinian Authority? And Hamas is supposed to be disarmed, and there's no way in the Egyptian plan explaining how this is going to be achieved. And Hamas has said flatly that it has no intention of disarming. So there are ideas in the Egyptian plan endorsed by the Arab states, but how exactly one gets from point A to point B is not clear. There is talk of reconstructing Gaza, which is supposed to cost $53 billion, and it is not at all clear where the money is coming from. So if we look at the Trump ideas, if there are ideas, and if we look at the Egyptian response, it's all pretty much up in the air. And Trump has used the term frequently that if this or that doesn't happen, the gates of hell will open. Well, so far, that has not been the case. And when the Arabs think of Trump's threats of the gates of hell or other threats, there is a tendency these days to take Trump a little less seriously than they did in the first days of his administration. So I conclude there, and I will gladly take your comments and questions as they may be. So thank you very much.
Asher, as always, clear, provocative, insightful, with rich analysis. Thank you. Thank you. I'd invite my colleagues on screen to unmute and to participate, because I'm sure they each have things that they'd like to pursue. And I invite the audience, the listeners, to use the Q&A function, unless I'm told otherwise, to use the Q&A function to submit questions or comments that we can share. And we'll monitor those. So let me just ask you to comment on something that you haven't raised in terms of this title of the new Middle Eastern balance of power. What about Russia and China? Do you see them kind of just as shadows pursuing their own interests, but not necessarily having a, they may have a confounding set of interests to pursue, but they are not determining? How do you see Russia and China now that Russia has lost its one major remaining Middle East partner, Syria, though it still has obviously relations with Iran, and China so far seems to be primarily focusing on political and economic influence and not involved in the conflict, although I understand that Chinese-Israeli relations have soured in recent months. So just start with that, if you don't mind, the Russia and China.
Well, I would look at both of them in terms of what is happening in Syria. This is where both China and Russia have say a possibly meaningful impact. Israel is reputed to be discussing with the Russians, as are the Syrians too, of maintaining the Russian air presence in Syria. Israel sees that as a way of stemming the Turkish influence. So an important Israeli general who is of Russian background flew to Moscow just a few days ago to talk to the Russians about this. Where that is going is not clear, but the Russians have come up as potentially influential back in the Syrian domain, where Israel may want to block Turkey, and the Russians would want to preserve what they've got in Syria, some air power and naval bases there too, that they would like to preserve with the new Syrian regime. As for China, I would say the influence is also a question that is being asked in Syria. If there is to be a new Syrian army and air force that will be built by the new regime, who are they going to buy their weapons from? And China is one of the possibilities that has been brought up. I would think not a great idea from the Israeli point of view. I don't think that above the influence that the Chinese have in backing up the Iranians, assisting the Iranian economy, in the recent reshuffling of the cards, the Chinese have not had a great impact to the best of my knowledge. And they're sitting by, waiting for things to develop. I think only making sure that things in Bab el-Mandeb, that is the entry to the Red Sea, don't get worse. The Chinese have an interest in preserving the freedom of navigation. They haven't done a great deal to contain the Houthis, but they have moved, let's say, a few means of influence, not to worsen the situation in Bab el-Mandeb, or to clash with the Americans there either.
John, I see your hand.
Thanks very much, Asher. That was panoramic and raises a lot of interesting thoughts and questions. I'll start with a comment. You ended with a reference to what Trump is threatening. I would suggest that it's that the gates of hell are probably already open for the Palestinians in Gaza, and Trump would just add to that. Going back to your beginning, though, you talked about the reservist army in Israel and how it's tiring, 300 days of serving, people worried about their families, their businesses, PTSD, the whole bunch of concerns. But at the same time, Israel is in Syria. It's in southern Lebanon. It's fighting forces in the West Bank. It's in Gaza. And there's actually talk about taking over Gaza. Not only taking over parts of it, but actually beginning to deliver humanitarian assistance in Gaza, which is an enormous ordeal if necessary. Where is Israel going to get the forces to do all of this? I guess that's one question. And then sort of just related is, you know, on the one hand, they've had great strategic successes. And on the other hand, there's this potential for quagmires of staying in Lebanon, staying in Syria, and another how many months or years in Gaza. So just your views.
But I think that precisely because of that reason, all these ideas are not attainable at one and the same time. Israel, I don't think, can establish a military government in Gaza. It's not doable. Not only is that not doable, but the war that is now being fought in Gaza is very low key. Hardly what the Israelis, before this round of fighting, said that they would do. This is very far from the gates of hell as predicted by Trump, or even by what the Israelis said that they would do. What the Israelis said they would do is not being done. And therefore the contention now coming through, where people are openly challenging the government and the military, that the war that is being fought is low-key only to serve Netanyahu's political survival, is achieving nothing in the military sphere, and will not retrieve the hostages either. That's exactly the critique, which is based precisely on this exhaustion of the reserve army, which cannot, I think the army is uncertain about calling up more reserve divisions, lest they do not report. When the war began on the 7th of October, reserve reporting was 150%. That is, far more people that were actually called up reported for duty. It's now the reverse. Instead of 150%, it's about 60%. That those who are being called up, not all of them are reporting. And there is, of course, huge bitterness in the families and amongst the reservists themselves about the fact that the ultra-Orthodox refuse to serve. Thousands of call-up papers have been issued, and a few hundred have actually reported for duty. The dissonance, the discrepancy, the moral confusion is so difficult to accept that we are talking seriously for the first time ever of a crisis in the reserve army. So I don't think all these objectives are attainable at one and the same time. And they will require a very heavy use of limited reserve forces, but mainly the regular army, which has a price too. If you use the regular army for these kinds of operations on a protracted basis, they do less training and lose the edge of their quality. These are huge issues for which there doesn't appear to be a clear response. And there is going to have to be some serious thinking about what Israel does on all these fronts at one and the same time.
Thanks.
Mark?
Thank you, Usher. I obviously agree wholeheartedly with what John and David have said in terms of your presentation, and we are so grateful for your continuing to be with us and provide us with your deep knowledge and experience. I have two issues that I wanted to address, if I may. One is the Iranian negotiations that are occurring, I think, tomorrow in Doha with the U.S.
In Oman, right.
And there was a report in the Times of Israel earlier today, just before we got on, which said that in a rare intervention, Iran's Supreme Leader Ayatollah Ali Khamenei was urged by his top officials to allow negotiations with the United States on the regime's nuclear program or risk the fall of the Islamic Republic, which seems to indicate that was the one, if that report is accurate, that was one of the motivating, if not the motivating factor in Iran agreeing to meet with the US in Oman. What I wanted to ask you is, do we have any idea of whether or not Israel was involved at all in these negotiations that are about to take place tomorrow? And if so, what involvement would they be? And then I have another point I want to get to.
Well, I think most of those in the know would say that Israel was never really consulted on the Iranian negotiations, not with Trump and not with previous governments in the United States. And the reason for that was the belief that US administrations had that if Israel was involved in the negotiations, it might interrupt them or torpedo them. And as a result, Israel has been usually sidelined in terms of these negotiations. And in the recent visit made by Netanyahu to the White House, it was pretty obvious that Trump completely surprised him. And in Israel, it has become an item of I would say, humor and mockery on Israeli night, what do you call them, late night shows. So I think that Israel is not deeply involved in these negotiations. And I think all that Israel can do is hope that Israel's concerns are taken care of. I'm not sure that they will be. And as I say, Netanyahu was completely surprised by this move that has just been taken. And again, the question is, what is the US objective? Is it only the nuclear issue? Or is it possibly something broader, that is a grand bargain with the Iranians over Iran's place in the region, which means two things. It also means accepting the Iranian regime as is, as part of the deal where Iran rolls back its nuclear project. And if you look at the logic of the nuclear project in Iran from the very beginning, it was very North Korean. It was about regime preservation. The nuclear device, the idea of having a nuclear capability, was to preserve the regime against external interference, rather than going to war with the United States or going to war with Israel for that matter. And I'm not sure that we played our hand as smartly as we could have versus Iran by taking the front line, which many in Israel's security establishment were opposed to from the very beginning, that Israel should never be the front horse, that Israel should be part of an international coalition, that Israel was threatening Iran, convincing Iran that Israel was a mortal threat, perhaps unnecessarily. And that I would argue now that Israel should be careful of not doing that with Turkey too.
Could I just, before I go to my next point, just mention that there was a report also, I think it was yesterday, and again, I don't know how accurate it was, that Trump was quoted as saying that if these negotiations in Oman break down and there's going to be some kind of military action against Iran's nuclear facilities, that Israel would be the one leading the charge.
Yes, that is what I also read.
And so that also, I wonder, you indicate that the Iran file wasn't really discussed when Netanyahu was at the White House in the Oval Office earlier this week, but query whether...
The idea of negotiating with Iran, the way it was presented, came, as far as I know, as a great surprise to Netanyahu. The fact that Trump uses the possibility of Israeli military action as a means of browbeating the Iranians into submission, or using it as a means of pressure on Iran, is also there. I don't know how much the Israelis are asked about that. and how much they have been consulted on using Israel in that way. But the Israelis certainly have shown that they themselves are willing to engage in a military operation against Iran. The question that is being asked here is that if Israel does engage in a military operation against Iran, and it does attack the nuclear facilities, then what? What is the strategic objective of attacking these facilities? Can they be fully destroyed? And if they are fully destroyed, then what? What does Israel do if the Iranians rebuild them? That's why there is a very good article in Haaretz the other day by a very intelligent former foreign ministry person in Israel, speaking about the grand bargain. That is not enough to talk about the nuclear issue. That for the sake of regional stability, the nuclear issue must be part of a grand bargain that has to do with Iran's place in the region as a non-threatening regional power, way beyond the nuclear issue. And if it is just focused on the nuclear issue, what is the strategic objective? If it is to knock out the nuclear facilities, that is an operational question. It's not a strategic objective. What is the strategic objective beyond that? What does Israel seek to obtain? That is not seriously discussed here. And if it is, we don't know. It's not publicized. But I have a serious suspicion that it's not being seriously discussed where it ought to be.
Let me just go to my last point, if I may, and bring it back into sort of the domestic situation within Israel, and that has to do with the current government. Recently, there's been one or two more Israeli commentators that I've been listening to who have suggested that for a variety of factors or reasons, there's a likelihood that the Israeli government could fall sometime in the next several months, leading to elections. I don't know how accurate that is, but it seems to me, and probably many of us here in the diaspora, that without a change of government, the needle, as it were, is not going to move very much on many of these existential issues facing Israel, both internally and the external issues as well. Comments?
Well, I think that what Netanyahu's appraisal was most recently, when the budget was passed at the end of March, that he had secured another year in government, and that this would lead to the expected political crisis that would be around about the spring of 2026. And it is far from a foregone conclusion, considering the status of the opposition, that Netanyahu will essentially lose those elections. If the elections were to be a reflection of the polls as we see them at present, Netanyahu is suffering from a lack of confidence of the general Israeli public. But what would happen in elections? What is going to happen to the Israeli legal and political system in the run-up to the elections? There are people who are beginning to express fears that there might not be elections. That a reason or an excuse or some other maneuver would postpone the elections. Or alternatively, if Netanyahu lost the elections, that they would refuse to abide by them, to do a Trump. So there is a lot of doubt that is part of the Israeli debate that I think one would never have imagined just a few years ago. But that is part of the reality as it is now being discussed. And therefore, I would say the emotions, the lack of trust, the lack of internal cohesion, the lack of consensus on key issues of state security, military warfare, the kinds of issues that usually did have consensus, don't. And it's not getting any better in the last few days. It's actually, I would say, becoming a little bit more extreme.
Okay, we have a few questions
Thank you, Asher.
that are being sent in, which I'll turn to in a moment. let me invite John first, and then I'll turn to those other ones.
Yeah, your just most recent comments about what's going on in Israel being Trumpian. I mean, the key question in both countries that is coming up is will the administrations abide by the decisions of their Supreme Courts? And with the bar and the Attorney General's cases, one in play and one coming up, that will be a key question in Israel, and it'll come up in the States again, I'm sure. So frightening, but all following the Orban plan, which is scary. I just one comment on the Iran thing. I mean, it would be great to have a negotiation with Iran, but I have this sense that both the current Iranian regime and the Netanyahu regime both use the other for domestic political purposes. And I'm just not so sure that Iran is, given their economic situation, their weakened strategic situation, whether they're willing to give this up. But I don't know how much that's a factor there. I just wanted to ask another question, though. You started by talking about the Arab deficit, and I would suggest that in Gaza, it applies to the Palestinians completely. But what about Palestinians in the West Bank? I mean, I have the impression that Palestinians in the West Bank are more educated, more secular, that they fall into that description that you gave to a lesser extent, perhaps, than some of the other Arab nations. Do you have that sense, or would you say that Palestine, Gaza, and the West Bank together also fall into that description? Because if they do, it presents concerns going forward on the governance front and on PA's ability to take over Gaza, etc.
Well, I think to a large extent they do, but not all the Arab states are exactly the same. I mean, if you take Jordan, for example, I would say Jordan and the West Bank are pretty much the same. In the sense that they both have higher levels of education, higher levels of female participation in the workforce, higher levels of gender equality, but still much lower than what is, let's say, the average for Western Europe. Where this is becoming very impressively different is in Israel, the Arabs of Israel, where there is a huge change in levels of education. Female participation in the workforce is way above average, where there has been a very impressive influence of Israeli Jewish society on Arab Muslim society in the way in which they behave as Israelis. And there are polls coming out in recent years amongst the Arabs in Israel who look at the Arab crisis that surrounds them and seek actively to become part and parcel of Israel as equal citizens in a liberal democratic state. And this is exactly where they clash with the trends of the government. That there is two parallel trends coexisting amongst Israeli Arabs: the desire to integrate into Israel and the desire to identify as Palestinians. And it doesn't always coalesce, these two sides of the coin. But you cannot imagine Israel contending with the COVID crisis without the 20% of the Israeli medical service staffed by Palestinians who are Israelis. From professors of medicine to the working class in the hospitals. 20% of the Israeli medical profession is Arab. And not to mention the legal profession and the universities. And in that respect, I would say the Arabs in Israel are an exception, more so than the people in the West Bank. And there is a certain, I would say, perhaps misrepresentation. You have areas in the West Bank, like Ramallah. Other places, like Nablus or Jenin or Hebron, definitely are very different. Far less westernized, urbanized, highly educated than a place like Ramallah, which also has a relatively large Christian population. So there are shades of difference. But Gaza is far worse off than the West Bank. That is absolutely true. But the West Bank, in most respects, is very much like Jordan, which is, say, par for the course from the problematique that I was talking about.
Mm-hmm. What you
It's
just
still
said,
very much there.
what you just said about Palestinian Israelis is particularly concerning, given the legislation that the
Exactly.
is trying to bring, which would reduce the likelihood of Arab-Israeli parties' ability to fight in elections.
And the nationality law itself in 2018, which is a disgrace. And it is, I would argue that the so-called legal reform began in 2018 with that law on nationality. That is the beginning of the legal reform. They just took a break for a while.
If I may,
But in terms of the philosophy behind it, that's where it began.
yeah, if I may, I just want to jump in and say I never use the word reform. Reform is a positive term, and I don't see that any of what they're doing is a reform. It's a more of an attack at this.
A coup.
Yeah, coup. Yeah.
Yeah, but that's the term that has been, integrated into the Israeli discourse. But I agree with you entirely.
So let me turn to one of the questions that has been submitted. It's pretty direct, and it won't surprise you as a core question, Asher. Michael Rival says or asks, if the Gaza solution proposed by Trump is no go, what is the alternative? Will 2.1 million Gazans stay in place? And if so, who will rebuild the hundreds of thousands of homes? And then you get into all the governance questions, of course, security questions.
Well, first of all, I can only, reaffirm the only way immigration will be of any significant size from Gaza would be if a series of Western countries would volunteer and give 500,000 visas to people from Gaza. I wonder what would happen if the same countries offered 500,000 visas to the Israelis. But I don't think that's going to happen. And since that's not going to happen, not in Israel nor in Gaza, there is no choice but to do the best, and there is a possibility of rebuilding Gaza. It's hugely expensive. But there's no other game in town. And there might be some migration from Gaza, but 2 million people are not going to pack up and leave Gaza. It's just not going to happen. So I think one has to, first of all, stop the war and allow for the reconstruction of Gaza. That in itself would take something like 10 years. And that is a project in itself that could be an element of peacemaking, the reconstruction of Gaza. And I don't think that there is any great alternative to that. What that requires, of course, is a huge investment coming mainly from the Arab countries. And the Arab countries, nor any other countries, are going to do this unless they are certain that this is not going to be pummeled by the Israeli Air Force next week. There's no point in rebuilding Gaza if there's no silver lining out in the future to have this all destroyed again in a week. So there's a lot of political preparation that has to be made and political agreements that have to be made. And this is where we go back to square one, the day after. What is the day after in the eyes of the Netanyahu government? How can you have a rebuilding of Gaza unless the Palestinian Authority is involved? If there's no Hamas involvement and no Palestinian Authority involvement, who in heaven's name is supposed to run Gaza? So here the Israeli government has to come forth with a different idea. And it's not the military government for Gaza, and it's not no thinking about the day after, but an eventual procedure which in the long run will strive to achieve something that will look like a two-state reality. There is nothing else. And people can argue from now until eternity whether Israel likes or doesn't like the two-state idea, but there is no other. And eventually, Israelis and Palestinians are going to have to come around to that kind of thinking. It's not realpolitik for the present. That's something that will come hopefully in the future. But that requires first and foremost the end of the war. And for that, you need a different government in Israel. And that is not forthcoming either in the foreseeable future. So we are locked in a kind of a vicious circle here with no obvious exit. And certainly strange ideas coming from the White House are not productive, to put it mildly.
Which is a nice segue into a question that Alex Zisman has posed. Let me just read it. Given the increasing political shift to the right in Israel, do you envisage that any elected government could be willing to accept the creation of a Palestinian state? And if so, under what terms concerning borders and the future of settlements in Judea and Samaria?
Well, I don't see an Israeli government that, as presently constituted, I don't see an Israeli government able to accept. But it would require a new Israeli government, and the only new Israeli government would be one that would include elements of the right as part of the government. Maybe not the extreme right, and maybe not the ultra-Orthodox, but the likes of Bennett and parts of the Likud that would be part of a future Israeli government that might be willing to, and probably would be willing eventually, for lack of any better choice, to accept the idea. It wouldn't be called a two-state solution, but it would be the gradual rolling back of the Israeli occupation. And that in itself would be a project for years. But instead of a project in which the occupation is reinforced day by day, to have the occupation rolled back. The maintaining of Israeli settlements in certain areas that are very densely populated by Israelis, close to the old Green Line, rather than the rest of the West Bank, which has a lot of dots of Israeli settlements, is far less secure in Israeli hands than people think. It's far more fragile and very weak economically, depending almost entirely on handouts from the Israeli government. Nearly half the settlers are Haredim. I don't think people know that. Haredim who live in settlements that are close to the Israeli border, and they bought housing there because it's cheaper, and they are the cause for, the main cause for such a population increase is Haredim, not ideological right-wing settler. So the Israeli hold on the West Bank is far less permanent and secure than I think a lot of people tend to think. And a lot could be changed if the government of Israel decided to change policy. But that would require a very different government to the one we have, that's clear. And as long as this kind of government is in power, then there will be no two-state solution. And there will be no two-state settlement. And what Israel will become in the next 20 years is not very encouraging to think or to imagine. Some kind of country where there is an Arab majority, ruled forcefully militarily by a Jewish minority. What kind of country do they think this is going to be?
It's a bleak picture.
It requires some imaginative political action.
Indeed. John.
So, Asher, let me ask you a controversial question. There was a conversation at a progressives conference a few weeks ago. JSpace, New Israel Fund, Canadians for Peace Now organized a conference, and they brought in three Jewish Israelis and a Palestinian Israeli, and there was a discussion of anti-Semitism and the real concerns about it here. But at one point, one of the Israelis said, "Look, what do you think is more important? A Palestinian kid screaming from the river to the sea on a campus in North America, or the destruction of liberal democracy in Israel?" His point was that the diaspora has an obligation to protest, to be critical, and to try and have influence. As far as I'm concerned, that's not even an issue. We have a duty to do that. But what's your view on going farther than that? You have a U.S. administration that is giving free hand for Israel to do whatever it wants right now in Gaza and the West Bank, etc. You see democracy in threat. At what point do you think that the West should think about sanctions against Israel if annexation were to proceed, if essentially they began to take over Judea and Samaria, the West Bank, and if the destruction in Gaza continued apace? At what point do you think the West should be trying to have a greater influence on what's going on, given that the US, there's no restraint anymore, which is the only country that's ever been able to restrain Israel?
Well, I must say, sanctions is a very strong word for me. And I think that is beyond what I would want other countries of any kind to impose on Israel. We are already in the university battling against this. There are sanctions against us already. We are facing increasing boycotts of our own scholars, our own universities in joint projects with other countries. We're already in the business.
Right.
And I think that's a very dangerous position, and I wouldn't want to appear to be accepting that as a legitimate means of assailing the Israeli position. But the fact that Jews or foreign governments should be restrained from criticizing Israel at all, lest they be accused of Jew-hating, self-hating, or anti-Semitism, is ridiculous in my mind. And I don't think the Jews of the diaspora should have any inhibitions about criticizing Israel for what Israel ought to be criticized, for what Israeli Jews criticize Israel. And I think that is a very legitimate part of the debate. And I don't think that it's legitimate criticism of Jews by other Jews that they shouldn't be criticizing Israel. I don't think that's the point. And governments shouldn't be constrained by doing so, by being browbeaten with arguments about anti-Semitism, about every condemnation of Israel. But sanctions, I think, is taking things a step further than I would imagine. And I would expect the Israeli government, long before sanctions, to relate to the international criticism and condemnation of Israel in a manner which is more enlightened than what we are doing. Throwing anti-Semitism at every criticism of Israel is ludicrous. It doesn't serve Israel's cause either. It makes us look ridiculous. And I don't think we should be doing that. And I think we should draw the line at sanctions. And in the hope that the Israeli public and government will be more open-minded enough to retreat on certain Israeli policies long before sanctions are made, a par for the course in the policies towards Israel.
Thank you. Thanks.
We're at our time, and I want to thank you, Usher. It's been very stimulating, interesting, and challenging, I think, for everyone who's had the opportunity to listen to you. I hope, of course, that you'll continue to support us with your insights and your wisdom, and come back and speak with us when we start up again in the fall. And let me just invite Les, if you'd like to say a closing word on behalf of Holy Blossom Temple that administers the program.
Thank you, David. Asher, again, very insightful, very helpful for us to try and understand a situation that is almost incomprehensible from our point of view, but really some good points and a little bit of clarity that came up. So I really thank you for that and for your view. To the panel, David, John, and Mark, thank you very much for your questions and your continued work on Israel Dialogues. And we'll continue with Israel Dialogues in the month of May. We have 3 or 4 sessions established, some of them with some new faces, new people, new views that we'll be able to go. I'm not going to go into them now, but watch your email for it. And we're going to be ending up at the end of May, just so you know, with Gabby Ben-Dor, who is a friend of Holy Blossom, and most of you very well know him. So with that, Shabbat Shalom, everybody. Chag Sameach.
Yeah.
Good weekend and a good Seder.
Yes, John.
Thank you all.
Thank you.
Be well, Asher.
You well.
You too.
That's to Miriam.
And again, Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.
Chag Sameach.